For 4 years, two little girls were simply gone. Then a police dog started barking at an old, forgotten basement. The mystery that had consumed a small town was about to break open, revealing a truth no one could have imagined, a truth that had been hiding right next door all along. Snow fell in a slow, silent curtain over Millbrook Falls as Grace Sullivan's heavy boots crunched on the frozen sidewalk. Her 58 years felt twice as heavy on that December morning, especially when the biting Minnesota wind cut through her worn coat. The deputy watched as Christmas decorations began to appear on the houses, a painful contrast to the emptiness she carried inside. Just 2 weeks remained until her official retirement, but Grace couldn't feel any sense of relief. The disappearance of the Carter twins, Hannah and Hope, still haunted her, a ghost that refused to rest. 4 winters had passed since the 7-year-old girls vanished on Christmas Eve without a trace. 4 years of fruitless searches, false leads, and shattered hopes. "Come on, Ranger," she murmured to the German shepherd trotting faithfully by her side. The dog, with a prominent scar on his right flank, was more than a partner. He was a survivor, just like her. Rescued after serving in the army, he carried invisible traumas that only Grace seemed to understand. The deputy paused before the old, abandoned Methodist church, letting her mind drift back to the details of the case. The girls were last seen playing in the Carters' backyard. No witnesses, no conclusive evidence. Just 2 empty chairs at Beth Carter's dining table, whose owner refused to accept that her daughters might never return. Back home, Grace followed her meticulous routine. She brewed strong coffee, fed Ranger, and sat at her kitchen table where the case files remained spread out. The current sheriff, Tom Bradley, had all but shelved the investigation, citing budget concerns and the town's reputation. "We need to move on," he'd say. To Grace, the words sounded like a betrayal. Night fell quickly, as it always did in the northern winters. As she ate a reheated soup, the deputy watched Ranger lying near the heater. They both carried scars. His were visible on his coat. Hers were buried deep in her soul. The loss of her own daughter years ago had made her stubborn, perhaps even obsessed with the twins' case. Grace closed her eyes, trying to push away the haunting images. The smiling faces of the girls on the missing posters. Beth's vacant stare. The fruitless searches in the woods. Tomorrow would be another day of unofficial investigation. Another day of trying to find answers before she turned in her badge for good. Ranger suddenly lifted his head, as if sensing his owner's restlessness. His attentive eyes met hers in a silent communication that transcended words. In that modest house, 2 wounded souls found comfort in each other, bound by an instinct and a pain they both knew all too well. The biting Minnesota wind whipped at Grace Sullivan's face as she and Ranger walked through the deep snow. It was a December morning like so many others in Millbrook Falls, cold, quiet, and heavy with memory. The retired deputy maintained her routine of voluntary patrols, even 4 years after the Carter twins disappeared. Ranger trotted a few feet ahead, his dark fur a stark contrast against the white landscape. The German shepherd, normally disciplined and methodical on his rounds, followed a predictable pattern Grace knew well. That's why, when the dog stopped abruptly in front of the ruins of the old Methodist church, Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "Ranger, come on," she called, adjusting her scarf. But the dog remained motionless, his ears pricked in full alert. Suddenly, he began digging frantically in the snow piled near what was left of the church's cellar. His barks echoed down the deserted street, shattering the small town's silence. Grace had never seen her partner act this way. There was an urgency to his movements, as if something vital was buried there. "What did you find, boy?" she asked, approaching cautiously. As she got closer, Grace saw a splash of pink emerging from the snow. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she knelt beside the dog. With trembling fingers, she dug around the object, revealing a small, childish mitten. A pink mitten, perfectly preserved by the cold, as if it had been lost recently, not 4 years ago. The air left Grace's lungs. The mitten was an exact match to the description of what Hannah and Hope Carter were wearing on the Christmas Eve they vanished. Beth, the girl's mother, had mentioned the little pink mittens with embroidered snowflakes over and over during the endless interviews. Ranger sniffed the object intensely, letting out a low whine. The animal seemed to understand the gravity of the discovery. "Good work," Grace whispered, stroking the dog's head as she carefully placed the mitten into a plastic bag. Something inside her, something that had gone dormant after years of failed searches, flared to life, a flame that Sheriff Tom Bradley and the rest of the town had tried to extinguish with talk of moving on and accepting the loss. Grace looked at the abandoned church, at the partially exposed cellar, and then back at Ranger, who remained on alert, as if waiting for her to understand his message. And she did. The Carter twins might still be alive, and the case that had defined and nearly destroyed her career had just been blown wide open. Grace Sullivan stood in Sheriff Tom Bradley's office, the small pink mitten in her hand. She was sure this would change everything, but the man's expression lacked the enthusiasm she expected. "A mitten? That's what you've got, Grace?" Tom shook his head, straightening papers on his desk. "How many kids have played around that old church in the last 4 years? This could belong to anyone." The retired deputy's stomach sank. "It's not just any mitten, Tom. It's identical to the ones Beth Carter bought the girls that Christmas. It was preserved like it was buried right after they disappeared." The sheriff sighed, running a hand over his tired face. He pointed to a stack of papers on his desk. "See this? Budget cuts, staff reductions, and the city council breathing down my neck to improve Millbrook Falls' image. You know what the mayor told me yesterday? That we need to stop being known as the town of the missing twins." Grace remained silent as Tom continued, his voice lower now. "It's been 4 years, Grace. 4 years without a single concrete lead. I can't officially reopen the case over a mitten found by a dog." "Ranger isn't just a dog," she retorted, her blood beginning to simmer. "He was trained for search and rescue. If he zeroed in on that spot, there's a reason." The sheriff handed the mitten back, avoiding her gaze. "Millbrook Falls needs to move on. Beth Carter needs to move on. And so do you, Grace." Leaving the station, the woman felt the cold Minnesota wind cut across her face. Ranger waited patiently by the car, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Seeing his owner, the German shepherd tilted his head slightly, as if asking how it went. "It's just us now, partner," Grace murmured, stroking his head. That night, sitting at her kitchen table, she spread out old case photos, police reports, and a map of the town. Her retirement was only 2 weeks away, and the pension she was counting on depended on a clean record. Investigating on her own meant risking it all. Grace looked at Ranger, who was resting by the heater. The dog's scars, remnants of his time in the army, seemed to glow in the yellow light. He had survived the worst and still trusted his instincts. "If you say there's something in that cellar," she whispered, pulling her old badge from a drawer, "then we're going to find out what it is." Grace Sullivan knocked on the door of the small wooden house on Maple Street. The biting Minnesota wind stung her face as she waited. After a moment, Dorothy Henderson answered, her blue eyes, framed by deep wrinkles, showing surprise at the sight of the retired deputy. "I thought you'd already hung up your badge," Dorothy remarked, inviting Grace inside. The modest home smelled of cinnamon and old books. Dorothy served tea in porcelain cups with chipped rims, while Ranger settled patiently by the fireplace. "I never told anyone this," the old woman began, adjusting her glasses. "I thought it was just the eccentricities of a man of faith after he lost his granddaughter." Grace leaned forward, her attention fixed. Dorothy had lived next to the old Methodist church for over 40 years, and her kitchen window offered a direct view of its side entrance. "Bill Thornton," she continued. "He'd show up at odd hours, always after 10 at night. He carried large, heavy-duty shopping bags, never empty." The old woman rose with some difficulty, leaning on her cane, and walked to a drawer. From it, she pulled a worn notebook. "I started writing down the dates. I thought he might be stealing from the donation box or something," she confessed, handing the book to Grace. "3 nights before the Carter twins disappeared, he made 5 trips. 5! Grace flipped through the yellowed pages. Dorothy had meticulously noted dates, times, and brief descriptions. The observant neighbor had unknowingly created a valuable log of the pastor's suspicious routine. "Why didn't you say anything at the time?" Grace asked. Dorothy looked down, her guilt plain to see. "Who would have believed me? Bill was a respected man. I was just a nosy old woman," she sighed. "Besides, after Emma died, he started bringing me soup and bread. Said God had instructed him to look after the lonely." The old woman stood again and led Grace to the window. From there, she pointed to a nearly invisible path through the shrubs that led to the back of the church. "He never used the front door, always that path, and he always came back, lighter, as if he'd left something behind." Ranger came closer, sniffing the air in the direction of the window. A shiver ran down Grace's spine. Dorothy's notes could be the first concrete evidence linking Bill Thornton to the disappearance of Hannah and Hope. "I'm ready to tell you everything I know," Dorothy said, her voice firm with resolve. "I've carried this secret for too long." Ranger's snout worked determinedly through the rubble, his movements fast and precise. Grace Sullivan watched the German shepherd, trusting his trained instincts. When the dog began to dig furiously, the retired deputy's heart began to race. Pushing aside splintered wood and broken concrete, she uncovered what the dog already knew was there. A heavy wooden door, cleverly camouflaged beneath the old foundation of the Methodist church. "Good boy," she whispered, stroking Ranger's scarred head as she examined the find. The door was surprisingly well maintained, with recently oiled hinges, a clear sign of use. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of her unsanctioned investigation pressing down on her. Tom Bradley would surely reprimand her for this, but she was past the point of caring about the sheriff's disapproval. As she pulled the heavy structure open, a smell of damp earth and confinement washed over her. The air was thick, heavy with mildew and something else, the recent presence of human life. A narrow wooden staircase descended into darkness. Grace switched on her flashlight and, with Ranger leading the way, began to carefully descend the creaking steps. What she found below made her stomach lurch. It wasn't just a cellar, but a series of interconnected underground rooms, meticulously built like a small apartment. There was a living area with a faded sofa, a makeshift kitchen with shelves of canned goods, and most disturbingly, a children's bedroom with 2 small beds. "My God," Grace murmured, shining her light on walls covered in colorful drawings, children playing, a bearded man holding their hands, and what looked like scenes of a hostile outside world, with rain and fire falling from the sky. Ranger sniffed every corner as the deputy examined the toys scattered on the floor. Handmade cloth dolls, wooden blocks, and children's books with bookmarks still in place. Everything indicated that Hannah and Hope Carter had been here, but the place was empty now. In a corner, Grace found a small shelf of religious books. Beside it stood a table with two child-sized chairs and colorful plates. Bill Thornton had created a complete, alternative home, a parallel world for the twins. He kept them here, she concluded, a mixture of horror and relief washing over her. But where did he take them now? Ranger suddenly barked, drawing her attention to a side door she hadn't noticed before. The dog seemed anxious, as if he knew they were only just beginning to unravel the mystery. Grace took a deep breath, steeling herself for what else she might discover in the depths of that underground refuge. The silence of the cellar was disturbing, but Grace Sullivan's experienced eyes immediately caught the details that spoke of a recent human presence. On a small makeshift table sat a plate with breadcrumbs, still soft to the touch. Beside it, a half-eaten apple. Dusk was beginning to fall, suggesting someone had been here perhaps a day or two ago. Ranger sniffed restlessly, his agitation confirming his owner's suspicions. The dog circled the confined space, his muzzle alert, investigating every corner of the subterranean room. "They left in a hurry," Grace murmured to herself, her eyes fixed on a set of small children's clothes, neatly folded on a thin mattress. The garments were the right size for children the age Hannah and Hope would be now, 4 years after their disappearance. On the opposite wall, a handmade calendar caught her attention. Meticulous hash marks crossed out the days, decorated with incomprehensible symbols and codes that seemed to make sense only to their creator. The last day marked was exactly 3 days ago, the day Ranger had first started barking at this spot. A shiver traced its way down the retired detective's spine. She had been so close. Perhaps her arrival with the dog had spooked Bill Thornton, forcing him to flee to a new hideout. In a darker corner, Grace found a cardboard box filled with colorful notebooks. As she opened them, her heart constricted. They were children's diaries, filled with the uneven, developing handwriting of a child. Drawings filled many of the pages, sketches of an old, bearded man, always depicted with a halo around his head, identified as Papa Bill. "Today, Papa Bill told us the Great Flood took everyone upstairs," read one entry in a shaky hand. "Only we survived, because he saved us in the ark." Another page showed a simplistic drawing of what appeared to be the outside world, with dark clouds, lightning, and stick figures being swept away by turbulent waters. Below, in a protected space, 3 smiling figures, a man and 2 little girls, watched in safety. Grace sank to the cold floor, flipping through the diaries with trembling hands. Bill had constructed an entire alternate reality for the twins, convincing them that the world above had been destroyed and that he alone was their protector. "He twisted everything," she whispered to Ranger, who patted closer, nuzzling his snout into her hand. He had turned a kidnapping into a salvation. The veteran officer photographed every page with her phone. These diaries were not just evidence. They were the key to understanding the girl's mental state, and perhaps the path to finding them. Grace Sullivan sat on the cold basement floor, surrounded by the remnants of a hidden life. Her fingers brushed against a small teddy bear, its fur worn thin by time and the love of a child's hands. The toy, abandoned in their haste, awoke a familiar ache she had kept locked away for years. Sarah, she whispered into the void. Her daughter's name rarely escaped her lips, as if speaking it might tear open a wound that had never truly healed. The retired detective closed her eyes, remembering the angelic face of the little girl she had lost to a relentless leukemia 7 years ago. The damp walls of the hideout seemed to echo with children's laughter. Some belonged to the Carter twins, but some belonged to her own memory. A photograph taped to the wall showed a smiling Hannah and Hope, wrapped in the arms of Bill Thornton. The old pastor had created an alternate world for the girls, just as Grace had tried to create one for Sarah during her final months, shielding her from the truth of her illness. The irony was a bitter pill. Ranger, sensing the shift in his owner's emotional state, approached silently. The German shepherd pressed his wet nose against Grace's hand, a familiar comfort he offered whenever he sensed her sorrow. She stroked the jagged scar along his flank, a mark of his own battles, his own survival. "I'm chasing ghosts, aren't I, boy?" she asked the dog, who simply watched her with his intelligent, attentive eyes. Maybe this case had never been about Hannah and Hope. Maybe it had always been about Sarah. The revelation hit her like a tidal wave. Her obsession with the twins' disappearance, her refusal to close the case when everyone else had given up. It was all a way of running from her own unprocessed grief. If she could save Beth Carter's daughters, maybe she could atone for her failure to save her own. Ranger lay down beside her, sharing the weight of the silence. The animal, also scarred by war and loss, seemed to understand human pain in a way that transcended words. Grace leaned her head back against the rough wall, allowing a few tears to finally escape. Among the children's drawings scattered on the floor, one portrait caught her eye. Two little girls held hands under a dark, stormy sky, sheltered by a large adult figure. In the corner of the page, written in a child's script, were the words, "Papa Bill saved us from the end of the world." The detective took a deep, steadying breath, wiping her tears away. Ranger rose to his feet, alert once more. There was work to be done. The twins were still out there, needing to be rescued, not just from their physical captivity, but from the twisted reality Bill Thornton had built around them. "Come on, boy," Grace said, rising with renewed resolve. "We have two girls to find." The dim light of a desk lamp illuminated Grace Sullivan's modest living room as she spread the diaries across her coffee table. Ranger dozed at her feet, occasionally lifting his head when she sighed or muttered to herself. The retired detective poured another cup of coffee, determined not to sleep until she had wrung some meaning from those childish pages. The notebooks were filled with colorful drawings and sentences written in unsteady letters. Grace noted that Hannah's handwriting was more organized, while Hope favored more vibrant colors. Both girls described their underground world as a refuge from the Great Flood, which Bill Thornton had convinced them had destroyed the world outside. It was around 3 in the morning when she found something that made her blood run cold. On several pages, the twins had drawn a large dog they called the Guardian. In the drawings, the animal had distinct scars on its left flank and a damaged ear, a perfect match for Ranger. A chill snaked down her spine. How could the girls have drawn, with such accuracy, a dog that had only arrived in Millbrook Falls 2 years after they had vanished? "This makes no sense," she murmured, stroking the head of the German shepherd, who was now watching her with his keen eyes. The only possible explanation was that the old pastor occasionally allowed Hannah and Hope to leave the hideout, perhaps at night, to observe the world that supposedly no longer existed. They must have seen Ranger during one of these clandestine outings. In one of the diaries, Hope had written, "The guardian protects us when Papa Bill sleeps. He's outside, but he knows we're here." Grace felt tears well up in her tired eyes. Without knowing it, her canine companion had forged a connection with the missing children. Beth Carter needed to see this. Her daughter's own words might help the psychologist, Sarah Mitchell, better understand the twins' state of mind when they were found. But more importantly, the diaries confirmed that Bill allowed controlled outings, which meant the girls could be anywhere in Millbrook Falls. Grace closed the last notebook and glanced at the clock. Almost 5 in the morning. She hadn't slept, but she felt more awake than ever. Ranger stood up as if sensing his owner's growing urgency. The dog seemed to understand that, in some inexplicable way, he was a fundamental part of this puzzle. "We're going to find them, partner," the detective whispered, placing her hand on the dog's scarred flank. "You already know them, don't you? Now we just have to find out where they are." Grace Sullivan spent hours in the dusty archives of the Millbrook Falls Town Hall. With Ranger lying at her feet, she sifted through old community records until she found it. A small death notice in the local paper, dated 3 weeks before the Carter twins' disappearance. Emma Thornton, 7, beloved granddaughter of Pastor Bill Thornton, passed away tragically following complications from pneumonia. The retired detective felt a cold dread wash over her. The pieces were beginning to click into place. Emma had been almost the same age as Hannah and Hope when they vanished. She photographed the clipping with her phone and continued her search, discovering that after his granddaughter's death, Bill had started missing his religious commitments. Dorothy Henderson confirmed the change when Grace visited her that afternoon. The elderly woman served tea in porcelain cups as she recalled those dark days. "Bill was never the same after Emma left us. He started talking about signs of the apocalypse, about how we needed to save the children." Dorothy sighed, adjusting her glasses. "We thought it was just the grief talking. No one wanted to confront him." Church records showed that the pastor had requested a temporary leave of absence, citing health problems. But witnesses reported seeing him buying large quantities of non-perishable food and construction materials. "He turned that church basement into some kind of bunker," Dorothy explained, her voice trembling slightly. "Said he was preparing a refuge for when the flood came again." Grace flipped through sermon notes found in Bill's abandoned office. In the margins, obsessive scribbles about saving the innocent and washing away a corrupt world. Personal tragedy had twisted his faith into something unrecognizable. What was most disturbing was how the Lutheran community had ignored the signs. The church council, worried about a scandal, had preferred to quietly sideline Bill rather than question his increasingly erratic behavior. "We all wanted to protect his reputation," Tom Bradley confessed when Grace confronted him with the evidence. The sheriff looked genuinely shaken. "Bill served this community for 30 years, and no one imagined he could kidnap 2 children?" Grace finished, her voice laced with accusation. Ranger, sensing the tension, leaned against his owner's leg. Grace stroked the German shepherd's head, lost in thought. Grief didn't justify Bill's actions, but it explained his twisted motivation. In the pastor's fractured mind, he wasn't kidnapping. He was saving Hannah and Hope from a world that, in his delusional view, was damned. The detective gathered the evidence in her folder. The case was no longer just about finding the twins, but about understanding the tormented mind that had taken them. Grace Sullivan parked her patrol car in front of Bill Thornton's residence on a frigid Minnesota morning. The biting wind carried flurries of snow that were already blanketing the modest home's roof. Ranger remained alert beside her, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. The front door was unlocked, the first sign that something was wrong. Stepping inside, Grace was met with a scene that was disturbing in its meticulous organization. Plates were perfectly cleaned and stacked in the kitchen, clothes were folded with precision on the bed, and the house was impeccably tidy. This was not the scene of a hasty departure, but of a carefully planned escape. In the fireplace, still warm ashes revealed that documents had recently been burned. The pastor had destroyed evidence, leaving behind only charred fragments that had escaped the flames. Grace carefully collected these remains with gloved hands, hoping they might still yield some information. In a partially closed drawer, the detective found what appeared to be a personal journal. The pages were filled with the old man's shaky handwriting, detailing escape routes, alternative hideouts, and constant references to the flood and the salvation of the innocents. There were crude maps of the caves near the limestone quarry on the outskirts of Millbrook Falls. "He's been planning this for years," Grace murmured, as Ranger sniffed restlessly around the corners of the house. Tom Bradley arrived with reinforcements an hour later. The sheriff, visibly shaken, examined the evidence and finally accepted what Grace had been trying to prove all along. "I'm officially declaring Bill Thornton a fugitive," Bradley announced to the officers present. "I want roadblocks set up and search parties at every possible hideout." The news spread through the small town like wildfire. Neighbors gathered in front of the house, their faces etched with disbelief. Dorothy Henderson wept silently, blaming herself for not speaking up sooner about the pastor's strange behavior. "How could we not have seen it?" a woman in the crowd asked. "He prayed with our children every Sunday." Grace watched the collective reaction, the initial shock giving way to anger, and then to fear. Millbrook Falls had always been a community that protected its own, but now it had to face the possibility that one of its most respected members was a monster. While the forensics team combed through the house, Grace called Beth Carter. The girl's mother deserved to know that after 4 long years, there was finally a concrete suspect and a real hope of finding her daughters. Beth Carter's home remained a shrine, frozen in time. Every day, she set the dining table with 5 plates. 2 of them were small and colorful, adorned with pictures of princesses that were now starting to fade. No one dared to comment on the ritual, not even when visitors arrived to find the silently painful scene. Beth never accepted words of comfort. When neighbors and friends tried to convince her to move on, she would simply smile, a hollow smile that never reached her eyes, and continue folding small pink and purple pajamas, as if her daughters would be wearing them that very night. "My girls are coming back," she would say, with a certainty that silenced even the most skeptical. "They'll need their things just as they left them." Grace Sullivan observed this routine with a mixture of admiration and concern. The retired detective recognized in this mother the same stubbornness that had kept her from closing the case. When she had first knocked on Beth's door after finding the pink glove, she had been met with suspicion. "You're just like the others," Beth had muttered, holding the door ajar. "You come here, pretending you care, but deep down, you've already given up on them." "I haven't given up," Grace replied, holding up the small glove inside a plastic evidence bag. "And neither has Ranger." Beth's eyes widened at the sight of it. Her hands trembled as she touched the plastic, as if she could feel her daughter's warmth through the barrier. "Hannah," she whispered. This was Hannah's. In the days that followed, an unlikely alliance formed. Beth began to share details she had never mentioned in official reports. How Hannah was afraid of thunderstorms, but Hope loved them. How they both spoke of a kind man from church who always gave them candy after the service. Bill Thornton, Beth said one afternoon, showing Grace old photo albums. The girls adored him. He always said that children were angels on earth. The twins' mother opened a drawer and pulled out a small children's book about Noah's Ark. Bill gave them this just weeks before they disappeared. He talked a lot about saving the innocent from the flood. A chill ran down Grace's spine. The pieces were starting to connect. While the town had moved on, resigned to the tragedy, two women, broken by loss, now stood united, distrustful of each other, yet determined to find the answers everyone else had given up on. The news of the Carter twins' possible location and Bill Thornton's escape spread like wildfire. In less than 48 hours, the quiet town of Millbrook Falls became the epicenter of national media coverage. News vans lined the central square, while reporters from Minneapolis, Chicago, and even New York set up a makeshift camp in front of the police station. Grace Sullivan watched the commotion with unease. The retired chief had never liked the spotlight, and now she found herself surrounded by microphones and cameras with every step she took. Ranger, ever watchful, stayed close to her side, growling low whenever a reporter got too close. Chief Sullivan, is it true the department ignored evidence for 4 years? A reporter with impeccable hair thrust a microphone in her face as she tried to enter the station. The pressure wasn't just from the media. Tom Bradley had called an emergency meeting with the town council. The sheriff looked as though he had aged 10 years in a week. We need a coordinated official statement, he argued, avoiding Grace's gaze. This town cannot be portrayed as an accomplice to a kidnapper. Longtime residents, who once crossed the street to avoid Beth Carter and her unending grief, now vied for interview time, recalling how they'd always been suspicious of the pastor's strange behavior. Dorothy Henderson, the one person who had offered truly useful information, refused to speak to any journalists, preferring the silence of her home. On the third night of the media circus, Grace found Beth sitting alone on a park bench, watching the spectacle. They never asked about my girls, the twins' mother said, her voice distant. For 4 years, no one asked what their smiles were like, or their voices. Now all they want to know is if they wore pink dresses or blue. Grace sat beside her as Ranger lay down at their feet. The weight of her impending retirement and the pressure to solve the case before turning in her badge made every hour feel heavier. We will find your daughters, the chief promised, not daring to mention the doubts that consumed her. Doubts about the condition they would be in after so long with a man like Bill. That night, upon returning home, Grace found an anonymous letter in her mailbox. Inside was an old map of the limestone caves on the outskirts of town, with a red pencil mark over one of the entrances. Ranger sniffed the paper and let out a single bark, as if recognizing something familiar in the scent. The race against time had begun. Ranger stopped abruptly at the entrance to the old limestone quarry. Grace Sullivan watched the German shepherd sniff the frigid air with a renewed intensity. The retired chief knew that behavior well. Her canine partner had found something important. "What is it, boy?" Grace asked, pulling her scarf tighter against the biting Minnesota wind. The quarry was only 5 miles from Millbrook Falls, but it felt a world away. Abandoned since the 19th century, the mining operation had left beyond a complex network of tunnels and caves that few locals even remembered existed. Grace recalled seeing a mention of it in old municipal records during her research, but no one had considered that Bill Thornton might know of the place. The dog moved forward with purpose, leading his owner to an opening that was almost invisible between snow-dusted rocks. Grace had to crouch to follow, feeling the weight of the years in her knees as she squeezed through the narrow entrance. The smell of damp earth and decay filled her nostrils as she finally reached a wider space. "My God," she whispered, switching on her flashlight. The beam of light revealed the unthinkable, a small, improvised camp. There were blankets, folded meticulously, cans of food stacked neatly, and most disturbingly, small children's clothes arranged on a wooden crate. Grace recognized the style immediately. They were just like the outfits Beth Carter kept preserved in the twins' room. Ranger continued his search, his nose to the rocky ground. Grace noticed distinct marks in the damp soil, large boot prints, clearly from an adult male, and next to them, the smaller impressions of children. "He was here with them," she murmured to herself, taking photos of the evidence with her phone. And recently, Grace scanned the site with an eye trained by decades of investigation. The former pastor had created a backup refuge, a plan B in case his primary hideout was discovered. There were crude maps drawn on paper, marking other entrances and exits to the cave system. A worn copy of the Bible rested on a flat stone, with several passages about the flood and salvation underlined. "You're clever, Bill," she said, as Ranger continued to sweep the perimeter. "But not clever enough." The chief photographed every detail, while her four-legged partner kept investigating. When Ranger barked from deep within the cave, Grace knew instantly. They had found more than just a hideout. They were on the right trail, and the Carter twins might be closer than anyone could have imagined. Grace Sullivan completely ignored Sheriff Tom Bradley's orders. She knew that every minute counted, and the bureaucracy of the Millbrook Falls Police Department would only delay the rescue. With a flashlight in hand and Ranger leading the way, the retired chief pushed deeper into the narrow tunnels of the old limestone quarry. "Come on, boy. Show me the way," she whispered, as the German shepherd tracked the scent through the damp air. The uneven, slippery ground made walking difficult, but Grace didn't slow her pace. Her joints ached with the cold that seeped from the rock walls, where stalactites glistened in the flickering light of her beam. As they ventured further into the subterranean labyrinth, the silence became almost tangible, broken only by the sound of dripping water and the dog's panting breaths. Ranger stopped suddenly, his ears pricked and alert. Grace immediately switched off her flashlight. In the distance, a soft murmur echoed off the stone walls. A child's song, almost ethereal. A shiver ran down her spine. After 4 years of searching, she was finally close to the Carter twins. Following the sound with extreme caution, Grace and her canine partner arrived in a natural chamber that had been artificially widened. What she saw left the veteran officer breathless. Bill Thornton had created a true subterranean sanctuary. 2 small beds with colorful quilts were pushed against the wall. Improvised shelves displayed religious books, children's Bibles, and neatly arranged toys. In the center of the space stood a rudimentary altar, draped in white cloth, holding candles, holy images, and drawings made by the children. Hannah and Hope Carter, now 11 years old, were kneeling side by side, wearing identical, though faded, dresses. Their hair, longer than in the missing persons photos, was braided in the same fashion. They sang a hymn in unison, their crystal-clear voices echoing through the cavern, while Bill, kneeling before them, swayed gently with his hands raised in prayer. "The Lord has protected us from the flood, children. He has guided us to this ark of salvation," the former pastor murmured, completely lost in his religious delusion. Grace watched the scene with a mixture of horror and fascination. The girls appeared physically healthy, but their eyes revealed years of isolation and indoctrination. The environment, though claustrophobic, had been organized with obsessive care. Stockpiles of food, stored water, even colorful drawings on the rock walls. Ranger let out a low growl, alerting his owner. The moment of truth had arrived. Grace took a deep breath, preparing for the confrontation that would forever change the lives of everyone in that underground sanctuary. The twins flinched against the cave wall when they saw Grace Sullivan. There was no panic in their eyes, only a distant confusion, as if they were observing a creature from another world. Hannah, the quieter of the two, gripped her sister's hand tightly while Hope tilted her head slightly, studying the retired chief. "You're safe now," Grace said softly, keeping her distance. "We've come to take you home." The girls exchanged a bewildered look. To them, this was home, the only one they clearly remembered after 4 years of isolation. The damp cave walls, decorated with children's drawings and Bible verses, represented safety. The outside world, according to Bill's teachings, had been destroyed by a divine flood. "There's nothing left out there," Hope replied with a surprising conviction for a child. "Papa Bill saved us. We're the only ones who survived." Grace tried to move closer, but every step made the girls retreat further. Their eyes, though young, held an adult's suspicion. The chief recognized the classic signs of Stockholm Syndrome that Dr. Mitchell had described during the rescue planning. It was then that Ranger, who had remained quiet at his owner's side, took a step forward. The German shepherd let out a low, soft bark, almost like a greeting. The sound echoed through the cave, reverberating off the stone walls. Hope froze. Her eyes widened, locking onto the animal. Something in that bark cut through the mental barriers built by Bill Thornton. The girl let go of her sister's hand, and to everyone's surprise took a hesitant step toward the dog. "The guardian," she whispered, the words escaping like a shared secret. With trembling fingers, Hope reached out and touched the scar that marked Ranger's flank. The animal stood perfectly still, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. The scar beneath the girl's fingers seemed to awaken something deep within her, a memory that Bill had failed to completely erase. "You were in my dreams," Hannah spoke for the first time, moving closer as well. "The dog who protected us." Grace watched, amazed, as Ranger built a bridge she could not. The girls, who moments before had rejected any contact, were now stroking the dog's fur with a sense of familiarity. It was as if a part of them had always known the outside world still existed, preserved in the dreams they shared of a guardian dog. "His name is Ranger," Grace explained gently, "and he helped us find you." Hope looked at the chief with different eyes now, still wary, but with a small spark of curiosity. The barrier was beginning to crumble, not by force but through the recognition of something familiar in a world they had been told no longer existed. The tension inside the cave was palpable as Grace Sullivan finally confronted the twins and Bill Thornton. The former pastor, upon noticing the retired chief's presence, tried to stand up abruptly from his makeshift altar, but something was wrong. His face grew pale, and he staggered, his trembling hand flying to his chest. "Papa, are you okay?" Hannah asked, rushing to his side as Bill collapsed onto the damp cave floor. Grace watched, stunned, as the two girls moved with a surprising coordination. Hope ran to a small wooden box while her sister checked the old man's breathing. There was no panic in their movements, only a mechanical efficiency that revealed constant training. It's his diabetes, Hope explained, returning with a small case. We need the meter and the insulin. The twins worked in perfect sync. Hannah checked Bill's vital signs while Hope prepared an injection with a dexterity that was shocking for a child. Grace moved to help, but the girls formed a protective barrier around the unconscious man. Do you know what you're doing? Grace asked, watching the children administer the medication with the competence of trained professionals. Papa Bill taught us, Hannah replied, her eyes never leaving the old man. He said that one day he might need us, that we would be his guardians. Ranger watched from a distance, sensing the complexity of the situation. The dog remained alert, as if he understood the delicate emotional balance unfolding before him. Bill slowly began to regain consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, disoriented, until they found the faces of the twins. A weak smile formed on his lips. My saviors, he murmured, his voice faint. You see how we need each other? The world out there, it wouldn't understand. Grace realized the profound depth of the twisted bond Bill had forged. The girls were not just victims, they had been transformed into caretakers, responsible for the survival of their own captor. The pastor had woven a web of mutual dependency, making their separation all the more complex. You've done a wonderful job, Grace said softly, her voice a gentle attempt to build a bridge of trust. But now, we need to get Bill to real doctors. Hope glanced at Hannah, then at Bill, torn. The retired chief saw the conflict raging in the children's eyes. Loyalty to the man who had raised them for 4 years warred with the stark reality now seeping into their isolated world. He'll die if he stays here, Grace added, her tone firm. And you know it. The twins exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Hannah nodded, taking Bill's fragile hand in hers. We'll help you, Papa, she said. Like you always helped us. Grace Sullivan watched the twins huddled in the corner of the cave, clinging to each other as if the world might shatter at any moment. When she extended a hand, Hannah and Hope flinched, shrinking further back, their eyes wide with terror. The flood will kill us, Hope whispered, her voice trembling. Papa Bill said, we're only safe here. The dilemma tore at the retired chief's heart. How could she get the girls out of there without traumatizing them further? They had spent 4 years believing the outside world had been destroyed. To them, this damp, cold cave was the only refuge left. We need specialized help, Grace murmured to herself, as Ranger lay down patiently near the girls, creating a silent, steadying presence. Using a cell phone with a fragile signal, she managed to contact Dr. Sarah Mitchell. The child psychologist arrived 2 hours later, escorted by officers to the quarry's edge. Unlike the uniformed police who frightened the twins, Sarah approached calmly, sitting on the ground a few feet away. You must be hungry, the doctor said, opening a small backpack filled with snacks. I brought something for us to eat while we talk. For 3 tense hours, Sarah worked to build rapport. She didn't directly contradict the reality Bill had constructed, but instead offered small, careful windows to the world outside. There's a place where you can be safe and see the sky at the same time, she explained gently. A place where your mother has been waiting for you for a very long time. The mention of Beth brought a flicker of confusion to the girls' eyes. To them, their mother was only a distant memory, nearly erased by years of isolation. Grace watched, feeling the immense weight of responsibility. Forcibly removing the children could cause irreparable damage, yet leaving them was unthinkable. Bill's condition, now stabilized but unconscious, further complicated the situation. They're showing clear signs of Stockholm Syndrome, Sarah explained in a low voice to Grace. The bond with their captor is real and deep. This is going to take time and patience. It was Ranger who finally broke the impasse. The German shepherd moved slowly, lying down between the girls and the cave's exit. Hope, fascinated by the animal, risked a touch of his fur. The dog remained perfectly still, patient. He's not afraid of the world out there, Grace said softly. And I promise we will be with you every step of the way. After hours of delicate negotiation, the twins finally agreed to leave, but only if they could bring a few belongings, and only if Ranger walked beside them. That first step out of the cave would be just the beginning of a long journey toward recovery. The snow was falling in heavy, silent curtains as the group emerged from the mouth of the cave. The howl of the wind mingled with the sound of sirens that cut through the quiet of Millbrook Falls. Grace Sullivan held Hope's hand tightly, while Hannah walked beside Ranger, her fingers tangled in his thick fur as if it were her only connection to reality. In the distance, Beth Carter stood motionless, her pale face a stark contrast to the crimson scarf wrapped around her neck. When the girls finally appeared against the white horizon, their mother brought her hands to her mouth, stifling a sob. 4 years of waiting culminated in this single moment, but Beth hesitated to approach. Her daughters were alive, but their distant eyes and defensive posture revealed they were no longer the same children who had vanished. "Mama?" Hannah whispered, the word fragile, as if testing a long-forgotten sound. The retired chief took a step back, allowing mother and daughters their reunion. Ranger remained a vigilant sentinel beside the twins, as if he understood his role as a bridge between two worlds. Tom Bradley watched the scene from a distance, his discomfort palpable. The sheriff who had fought so hard against reopening the case now faced the crushing weight of his own negligence. Around him, townspeople began to gather, bringing blankets, hot drinks, and offers of help, the same community that, for years, had preferred to forget. "They will need time," Dr. Sarah Mitchell explained, moving to Grace's side. "The world Bill created for them is all they've ever known." Grace nodded, the relief of a mission accomplished, mixing with an internal storm of her own emotions. Finding the girls had been her obsession for years, but now that the case was closed, the void of her own loss began to reassert itself. Dorothy Henderson, leaning on her cane, approached timidly. "I should have spoken up sooner," the old woman confessed, tears tracing paths down her wrinkled cheeks. "You spoke up when it mattered," Grace replied, gently touching her neighbor's shoulder. As paramedics prepared the girls for transport to the local hospital, Beth finally managed to embrace her daughters. The contact was awkward, almost formal, like meeting a familiar stranger. Amid the tense reunion, Grace watched Bill Thornton being carried to an ambulance. The former pastor, now a frail and broken man, glanced one last time toward the twins before the doors closed. The snow continued to fall, covering their footprints, laying a clean white blanket over the past. Grace felt Ranger lean against her leg, his silent, familiar way of sensing her pain. Together, they watched the beginning of the long journey of healing that awaited them all. In the days that followed the rescue, Ranger became a constant presence in the lives of Hannah and Hope Carter. The German shepherd, with his own war-torn scars and watchful eyes, seemed to understand the twins' trauma better than any human could. When the girls retreated into themselves during sessions with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the dog's silent entry into the room was enough to make their shoulders relax and the words begin to flow. Grace Sullivan observed this transformation with a mixture of pride and awe. "He always knew where they were," she remarked to Beth one afternoon, as they watched the girls playing with the dog in the snow-covered yard. "Maybe he sensed something we couldn't." The twins, still wary of an outside world they believed had been destroyed, found an anchor of safety in Ranger. Hope, the quieter of the two, was the first to give the dog a special name: Guardian. The name caught on quickly, and soon even the residents of Millbrook Falls were calling him that. "He keeps our secrets," Hannah explained to the psychologist during one session, stroking the dog's coarse fur. "And he doesn't judge us for believing in Pastor Bill." Dr. Mitchell noted in her report how the bond with the animal was accelerating the children's readaptation. "The dog represents a safe emotional bridge," she wrote. "Unlike adults, he demands no explanations and carries no expectations of who they ought to be." For Grace, her relationship with her canine partner had also transformed. On cold Minnesota nights, when memories of her own lost daughter made sleep impossible, Ranger would lie beside her, a warm, breathing presence that seemed to understand their shared pain. The retired chief realized they both carried invisible scars, his from war, hers from grief, and that these marks, rather than weakening them, had become their greatest strength. Tom Bradley, initially skeptical of the dog's importance to the investigation, had to acknowledge his role. "Maybe we should have a permanent K-9 unit at the station," he admitted during a town council meeting. Dorothy Henderson, the elderly neighbor who first mentioned Bill's suspicious activities, took to leaving homemade biscuits on Grace's porch. "For the four-legged hero," the accompanying note would read. As the snow continued to fall on Millbrook Falls, Ranger became a living symbol of how, sometimes, we need someone who can see past appearances to find us when we are lost. Snow fell softly on Millbrook Falls as Hannah and Hope Carter sat on a bench in the Central Park, bundled in the warmth of new winter coats. Beth Carter watched her daughters with tear-filled eyes, still adjusting to the reality of having them back after 4 long years. Ranger lay at the girls' feet, ever vigilant, his presence a visible comfort. Hope reached out a small hand and touched the scarred notch in the German shepherd's ear, a gesture that had become a silent ritual between them. "You were there when it was cold," she whispered, her eyes reflecting memories only the two of them shared. The dog responded with a slight tilt of his head, as if in perfect understanding. Grace Sullivan watched the scene from a distance, leaning on her cane. The retired chief had finally found peace, having solved the case that had nearly consumed her. Now, instead of case files and reports, she carried only a small photo album where she kept the memories of her own lost daughter. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had helped Grace understand that saving the twins wouldn't bring her own Sarah back, but it offered a different kind of healing. The entire town seemed to breathe differently. The residents, once divided by guilt and indifference, now rallied to help the girls reintegrate. Dorothy Henderson was knitting them new gloves to replace the single pink one that had been the first clue. Tom Bradley, finally acknowledging his mistake, had started a community watch program to protect the local children. Hannah, the quieter of the two, pointed to the sky, where a ray of sun broke through the snow clouds. "There was no flood," she said in a soft voice, still deconstructing the stories Bill Thornton had planted in her mind. The former pastor, now in custody and undergoing psychiatric treatment, would face the consequences of his actions. though the twins still asked about him from time to time. Beth wrapped her arms around her daughters gently, respecting the space they still needed. "Let's go home," she said. "I made hot chocolate." In the distance, the bells of the now Reformed Methodist Church chimed 6 times, their sound echoing across the valley. Ranger stood up first, as if he knew it was time to move on. Grace gave a discreet wave and turned to leave, her mission complete. The scars would remain on them all, visible on Ranger, invisible on the rest. But now they served as a reminder of survival, not just of pain. In Millbrook Falls, the winter would remain as harsh as ever, but for the first time in 4 years, it carried the promise of spring.